So prior to that, and indeed to set the scene for the panel discussion, we're going to have Jeff Pradhan, my good friend. He's the Sales and Marketing Vice President for Peregrine Development International, who are the developers of the Global Gateway Logistics City. Fantastic whole park there, and of course the co-organizer of today's event. Jeff's also previously served as the president of the Clark Investors and Locators Association. He's got many years of professional experience, specifically in defense contracting, and as you can see from your program, he was responsible for providing some contracting plan management to support the Defense Logistics Agency on the worldwide missions for energy resources to the military. Very interesting as well, Jeff also worked with the Office of the President of the General Assembly of United Nations in New York, where he was doing extensive research for the Office of the President, including looking at research papers on the rule of law, international trade and development, and United Nations reform. So to talk us through the private sector wish list for Clark, please welcome from Peregrine Development International, Vice President Jeff Pradhan. Jeff.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this first of what we hope will be a yearly event for Clark, for aviation, and for basically the Philippines in general. What I'm going to share with you guys right now is a survey that went out in advance of the conference to kind of find out tap the pulse of the private sector, get a feeling from some of the stakeholders within the local area, within the region, within the country, of what they see in terms of Clark, Philippine aviation, and the role of Clark within the Philippines' broader aviation. So that's what I'll be going through. I want to share with you guys first some of the questions that we went out to the respondents with. And the questions we went out with was to develop Clark International Airport into a viable passenger logistics hub. What action points must the government implement? What contributions can private sector entities like EcoZone locators, airline operators, and logistics companies provide? What role should the private sector play in the development of Clark? What role should the Philippine government play in the development of Clark? And what role should Clark play in the Philippines' overall aviation infrastructure? So some of these I've combined because the variety of responses were quite extensive. So I've tried to condense some of that and to make it more palatable for you guys to see here now. So the respondents that these questions went out to, and some of the feedback came back from the aviation industry in terms of carriers, manufacturing sector, real estate developers, transportation logistics operators, tourism and hospitality industry, NGOs, and public sector, just regular public citizens. So instead of just providing you this feedback, I wanted to also throw in some perspective, which I think helps to understand some of the feedback that was provided. So the government's role in developing the Philippine aviation infrastructure, I have the logos here of the various agencies. You know, Faye and other presenters have talked about the collaborative effort that takes place in the national government's scale to address Philippine aviation infrastructure, Clark among that, tourism promotion, and all of that. So it's not one specific agency. DOTC is certainly maybe at the forefront, but you would say BCDA is right there, DOT is right there, BOI is right there, and it's all a very collaborative effort in terms of promoting the Philippines through that connectivity that you get from your aviation infrastructure. So the Philippine government proclamations, this is one of the things I wanted to go through. And what I'm going to kind of go through is directly related to the feedback that came back from the respondents. So over the last 15, 20 years, there's been a variety of proclamations from the government. I have a timeline here that kind of jumps around, but you can see it's gone all over the place. From Clark, basically the turnover transition from a military installation to a Freeport zone. The first proclamation from President Ramos saying, you know what, Clark's going to be the next international gateway. It's going to eventually supplant and support and complement NAIA. But since then, 2003, you've had talks of the North Rail project. Where is that going? When is that going to happen? Start, stop. You've had 2004, some expansions, improvements done at Clark in terms of infrastructure. 2007, you've had this concept of floating the idea of a twin airport concept to support Luzon and Philippine aviation infrastructure. But recently now you've had in 2010, as recently as 2010, you've had NAIA being said to be sold, outright sold, and then that money utilized to then develop Clark. So a complete 180 change from the twin airport concept. Recently again, you've had Clark cannot be developed until you have a high-speed rail link. And now most recently you've had, no, we're going to do something in Bulacan by San Miguel or some other conglomerate. So all of this is kind of detracted from any kind of logical, coherent effort that has been sustained. And what that's caused from the private sector perspective is uncertainty. And as anybody from the private sector can tell you, uncertainty leads to less investment and lost opportunities. So again, another aspect is death by study. So beyond the proclamations, you've had starting, and not even starting in 2008, Ben probably is the best person to talk on this, but he gave us some of this perspective this morning. Maybe a decade ago, starting with President Ramos's proclamation, we're going to utilize Clark and take advantage of that infrastructure and that asset that's there. We've had study after study leading up to these last ones, with JICA coming out and saying of the alternatives to NAIA, which one is the best, and clearly stated Clark was the only viable option. But yet you still have another study being done, or another proclamation being done in contrast. So this kind of confusion has hurt basically the environment for investment, and from a private sector perspective, has made it difficult to really get behind Clark. And actually, let me go back. This is a nice quote out of the Philippines Times. This was in an op-ed piece. The Philippine risks wasting time and resources that it does not have by not developing Clark and by doing these further studies. Instead of, it's not necessarily developing Clark, just support the organic development that's taking place already. So in addition, everybody's familiar with the Category 2 status. This again has been something of a hindrance and something that's certainly on the radar for the private sector. A variety of industries, obviously the tourism sector, obviously the airline carriers who'd like to and provide that long haul to the North American market. But it's not just the North American market that this has affected. We're talking about Japan following suit. We're talking about the EU following suit. There's several nations that have followed what the FAA downgrade and banning of additional flights from the Philippines. They follow that, and that's hurt the lost tourism and economic opportunities for the Philippines. So this started in 2008. Just right now, the most recent update is that they are doing an audit this week. Now, everybody's very hopeful that that's going to go through and finally lift Category 2 status, but we'll wait and see. But the reality is that is certainly a significant aspect to really becoming an aerotropolis, to be increasing the connectivity. Another aspect that's definitely on the radar from the private sector perspective is the common carrier tax. Now, this one's certainly being addressed, and it's great to see by the Congress recently passing in December 2012 Senate approval, Senate Bill 3343, that's removing the common carrier tax, repealing it. But we've already seen the damage that's happened from this common carriers tax, and that is foreign airlines have ceased operations in Manila, specifically citing the CCT. And to give you an example, there's British Airways, Lufthansa, Alitalia, Swiss International Airlines, and the most recent KLM was the final one. So right now, out of the Philippines, there is literally no direct connectivity to Europe. That's very, very significant when Greg talks about the connectivity and what that does for an economy. The fact that one flight to Japan can bring in 10 million square meters of Japanese investment, or $123 million in one flight in 1 year. So the fact that we don't have direct access to the European market is very, very significant, not only for the Philippines, but certainly for Clark. So I wanted to also give a case study, because this is another point. Again, I'm generalizing. I'm trying to synthesize and package some of the responses that we received to be able to present it to you more coherently today. So I'm using Cebu Pacific as a case study for this. If you look at Cebu Pacific in terms of the liberalization of the air market, in terms of the pocket open skies and the success, the last speaker mentioned this. Other speakers have mentioned this. This has been tremendous. Basically, the best example is the low-cost carrier explosion that's taking place around the country. But just microcosm of that, look at Cebu Pacific. It used to be a monopoly. It used to be PAL that had sole access to air connectivity and in and out of the country, and that really did not improve growth. That did not improve connectivity. Very few examples of monopolies do. So PAL, in every attempt, would try to stifle, thwart any new entries, increase the barrier requirement for new companies to come in and operate. Cebu Pacific is one of these companies that was able to do so maybe 10 years ago. Very small, came into the market, found a niche within the low-cost carrier market, not necessarily competing directly with PAL in terms of full service, but doing that low-cost niche. So they came in, and just some of the most recent, Cebu Pacific actually just recently bought over a very aggressive expansion they're going through right now, about 100 planes that they've just put on order to buy. And this is their future growth. So they're betting big on aviation infrastructure increases. They're betting big on what other presenters have talked about, this growth in just service operations. Very few of the overall Filipino market have flown. There's so many first-time flyers. That's a significant market that's just now starting to be tapped. Not only here in the Philippines, but all the places that, say, Cebu Pacific, AirAsia, and others fly to. They're tapping into this first-time flyer market. And you see it in their campaign slogans, everyone can fly and everything else. But if you look at what they're doing, Cebu Pacific now has outstripped PAL. In a decade, they went from nothing to more market share of domestic market than PAL. It's unbelievably significant. And it goes to show the benefits in the entire country of air liberalization. And that's a significant factor not only for Clark, where you now have this low-cost carrier explosion, and there's actually more low-cost carriers in Clark than there is in Manila, than there is anywhere else in the Philippines. So this is certainly something to continue to tap into. And with AirAsia hubbing at Clark versus any other location, that's another significant sign of this and tapping into this. They certainly see it. So the private sector wish list then of all these points that I've kind of drawn into in these examples is the private sector would like a clear, and this is on the Philippine aviation infrastructure at macro level, a clear and enumerated plan for the country's aviation infrastructure, a timeline for implementation of this plan, an execution of the plan, achieve Category 1 status, repeal the common carriers tax, and increase liberalization and competition in the environment, in the Philippine aviation environment. Now, going into the private sector role, as I went through those questions in the beginning, where does the private sector fit in? So what contributions can they make, and what role should they have in the development of Clark? And if you look at it, I kind of broke it down first to just show who the stakeholders are in this environment. So some of these you certainly would be familiar with. Common sense makes sense that airline carriers are certainly a stakeholder. MRO, maintenance, repair, overhaul facilities are stakeholders. Aviation training, manufacturers, real estate developers, cargo logistics, and also tourism stakeholders. So you have a broad range of stakeholders from the private sector who all need to certainly work with the DOTC and the BOI and these other government sector groups. And what I wanted to do was kind of show you the role that the private sector is already playing. I would say the private sector is fulfilling the role that has been asked of them. The respondents that have come back have certainly said there's certain improvement in synergy in working with the government and working among the stakeholders to increase the benefits that Clark can offer, increase the benefits of what tourism packages can be offered in Clark, medical tourism. But I would tell you, if you look through these next couple slides that I'm going to present, the private sector is already leading the way in this effort, and they've done a phenomenal job to date, and I think that's only continuing. So on the airline side, again, going back to the low-cost carrier environment here, very significant. Clark is the #1 low-cost carrier hub and airport for the Philippines, and you've seen the growth that's taking place. Other panelists and speakers have mentioned this. 1.3 million passengers last year, maybe not so significant in the larger scale of things, but what is significant is in the next 3 years, you're talking about very close to 10 million passengers being here at Clark. So one of the fastest growing airports in the world, both on the international side and the domestic side now, and certainly this goes into what you'll see here, I'll show you in a little bit with Emirates. But tremendous growth that has to be kept up with, really, at this point. The MRO facilities I mentioned, you're already seeing investment. This is Singapore Airlines Engineering has committed $100 million investment for 5 MRO facilities, maintenance, repair, overhaul facilities. This, again, is a Cebu Pacific joint venture with Singapore Airlines and Cebu Pacific. They already have their first hangar up that's been servicing A320s for about 2 years plus. They currently are building right across from that hangar another A320 hangar. I met with Rene Bengzon, who will be joining the private sector panel here after me, and he's shared the plans for Singapore Airlines. In the next month or two, they'll be breaking ground on the wide-body hangar, and then before the end of the year, they'll be breaking ground on the A380 hangar. And they have space there for a total of 6 hangars. So very significant what they're doing. In addition to Singapore Airlines, I don't have the graphic here, but there's Metrojet. Metrojet is out of Hong Kong, and they're servicing basically the Learjets, the corporate jets, which have really no option in Hong Kong anymore because there's no room. No options in many Chinese aviation centers because of room, and no options in Singapore. So now Clark is becoming a destination of choice for Learjets, for corporate jets, maintenance, repair, and just the stationing of them here. Flight simulation, Arby was one of the provided a question earlier, but another joint venture, Cebu Pacific and Canadian Aerospace Engineering, they put up a $50 million facility, full motion simulators for A320s. Open, they've got their first 2 simulators in operation today. I was able to see that facility as well. Very, very impressive, completely high tech, and that's just the first part of it. They're going to have another 2 simulators going in there, potentially even wide-body aircraft, A330 planes being provided in terms of simulation. And this is meant to be a regional simulation training center, not just for Cebu Pacific, but for the region. So this brings in that connectivity, that brings in that hub that Greg talked about. The hubs are getting hubbier. These are the types of activities that the private sector is already bringing to the table to really promote and make Clark more of a destination. On the manufacturing side, there's Jamco, and there's several others beyond this in many of these categories, but I'm just giving you kind of a sampling. Jamco has come in and they're doing aviation plane interiors. They basically are building the kitchen areas, the cabinetry, the areas where the stewardesses and stewards operate. And they're doing this for both Boeing aircraft and Airbus aircraft. Very significant that they've decided to choose Clark. And what's significant about this is that when one comes in, many others follow it. It always happens that way. Just like Emirates. You're not going to see Emirates come in by themselves. Emirates has a whole ecosystem of other groups that follow their moves. They don't do their own route planning. They don't really follow anything except, oh, Emirates is going? Okay, we'll be right behind them. Same thing with these manufacturers. It becomes easier for them to operate in terms of logistics, in terms of manpower, in terms of education resources when they all come into an area. So I mentioned this logistics side. I'm not on the government sector, so I can kind of hint maybe a little bit more than some others that one of these 2 major players who was here before and still operates here is very close to coming back to Clark and very close to coming back to the Philippines because they left recently and have found it difficult to operate in China, as many other companies have, and have now decided, you know what, it's probably time that we look at coming back to Clark for our operations. But currently, right now, you still have 13 flights per week, technical stops, being done by UPS and FedEx through Taipei into China, where the main volume is. But that's still happening at Clark. But what you're going to see is an increase in this, especially with Emirates. Emirates wide-body aircraft is going to provide, I can't remember the figures, but an enormous amount of cargo space that can now reach Dubai and pretty much anywhere in the world from there. So that's going to provide an opportunity for Texas Instruments, Samsung, and many other locators who are here right now and unfortunately still shipping out of Manila because they don't have the ability to ship out air freight through the narrow-body aircraft to now do it at Clark. So that's going to only improve what you're seeing logistics-wise from Clark. Real estate developers, you have GGLC, you have Berta Phil, you have PhilExcel, you have Dong Wong. You have a variety of groups who are here providing commercial space, office space, BPO space, logistics space, manufacturing space. And this is certainly something that's necessary. And really the key factor for this is the planning. Land use planning within the airport complex is very important, and land use planning outside of the airport complex is very important, as Greg and others have alluded to. And so you already have players in this sector who are anticipating this airport's growth, anticipating the businesses that are going to be coming in because of the connectivity provided by the airport, and are catering to that. So talking about the Philippine aviation and Clark and the role that it will play in the Philippine infrastructure, here's some of the connectivity that already exists today in the region. Clark already has more international flights and passenger volume than Cebu. Cebu is a domestic hub. It's always had more domestic passenger volume than Clark. But Clark, for whatever reason, the way it developed, has always been kind of a regional international hub, and especially for the low-cost carriers. Now what you're seeing, beyond the international connectivity, is the domestic connectivity. This has happened just recently within, I'd say, the last maybe year and a half, 2 years, but certainly with Cebu Pacific, AirAsia, Airfield Express, these guys are now being able to link you from Clark to Puerto Princesa, Kalibo, which is Boracay, Cebu, Davao, and soon to be many others. But what this has done, straight out of the mouth of the Emirates Vice President for Route Planning, is this has provided basically the loop within the Philippines that can pick up all the potential OFWs and other travelers who can then board that wide-body aircraft from Clark and now go over to the Middle East. Obviously, the OFW population there is significant, around 3 million OFWs, a majority of them coming from central and northern Luzon. So those can reach Clark without any problem, but even the ones in the other parts of the country now have the connectivity to get to Clark and get to the GCC countries now. So in addition to that, what else is being seen in terms of the connectivity that's being provided by Clark? This is something that SEAC has shown, and this is tremendous. Again, all very recent, but Dragonair, a subsidiary of Cathay Pacific, which you can check in at Clark and check through to any other destination in Dragonair in their entire network around the world with your baggage and your ticketing, so you don't have to go back in and customs and immigration. You check through at Clark and you can get to anywhere in the world that Cathay Pacific services through Hong Kong. AirAsia, this is great. I didn't find this graphic until I looked at the souvenir program that they just updated this. I actually have done this. I went to Bali through Clark, checked through baggage. Phenomenal. Completely efficient, stress-free, and just a wonderful experience to not have to go through immigration and not have to read these processes. AirAsia's connectivity through Kuala Lumpur is unreal in Asia. And so basically now you're seeing four destinations in Australia being serviced, 3 in Indonesia, and then the rest of the region being serviced, all through AirAsia with its hub at Clark and its main hub in the region at KL. So Emirates obviously being the major, most recent announcement, starting flights in October 1. And what is that going to mean for Clark? Well, let's put it in perspective. Emirates, one of the largest airlines in the world. We're talking about destinations, 22 in Africa, 31 in Asia, 34 in Australasia, 32 in Europe, 11 in Americas, and 17 in the Middle East. So 147 global destinations you can now reach through Clark. That's a game changer, fundamental game changer. Greg mentioned it. Why does he believe in Clark? Why was he willing to come and speak? Because if Tony Fernandez and Tim Clark, 2 of the smartest guys, most aggressive guys in the aviation industry today, are putting their bets on Clark, that's something to be said right there. So the catchment basin, this has been shown before, but I think it's worth putting it in context with Trinoma. What SEAC has done with this new airport terminal, and again, this is a private sector partnership with the government. Ayala provided the facility at Trinoma Mall. And if you look at this catchment basin that others have shown today, talking about it's not just Manila that needs to be serviced, it's really regions 1, 2, 3, the autonomous region, and even the northern environs of Metro Manila, Caloocan, Balintawak, Valenzuela, and Quezon City, all closer to Clark by time. Not by distance, but by time, which is really the factor, and accessibility, because you can hop on the NLEX and get here much faster than you can by fighting through EDSA and the other areas to get through to NAIA. So when you look at this demarcation line, that's basically the northern environs of Metro Manila. And if you look at it, where is Trinoma Mall? That is basically the demarcation line, and that's now where you have this airport terminal with bus service on a half-an-hour basis. Every half an hour you can get a bus to Clark, and very soon, the second phase of it, providing the actual check-in at the Trinoma terminal. So significant, very significant. What's the private sector doing to link it to the overall aviation infrastructure? This is a great example of that. So this is also, hasn't necessarily been shown, but I think it's very, very relevant to put things in perspective. Greg has mentioned this. The orientation of the runways being so key for aviation today. The old design of airports was certainly cross runways. But now with technology, with the planes being able to handle crosswinds, now basically you want nothing but parallel runways. And they can service much more flights per hour, in terms of air events, landings and takeoffs, and they can also operate independently. Whereas NAIA has cross runways perpendicular to each other and essentially means on the operation side you're talking about one runway that's usable at a time. Clark has 2 parallel runways today, and the ability to put in a 3rd independent parallel runway. With that setup at Clark, you can go up to 80 million passengers with the 3 independent parallel runways. NAIA is at capacity at 40 million passengers, and it will remain that way, just very similar to Washington, D.C., Reagan National Airport. 1 runway, 1 operational runway, that's what you can get out of it. Very good for the capital region. You can't really improve or fix it. In addition to that, 645 hectares is the size of the entire airport complex. Anybody who's here who's flown out of NAIA knows you can't transfer between terminals. You can't transfer your baggage. You can't transfer your person. So you've got to physically leave the terminal you're at if you're going to fly into Manila from the international market, and then you want to transfer to a domestic flight to Boracay or Davao or one of these areas. You've got to get out of the airport, check out, get your baggage, drive in a taxi, half an hour at least, depending on traffic, to the other terminal to then catch your connection flight. Nowhere in the world is that happening anymore. Everybody's trying to design that out of the system, and you can't fix that for NAIA. So Clark has the ability to master plan this up front. They've done the land use plan, as Ben has mentioned. So they have the ability to get these things right today, moving forward. I mentioned that land use plan. This is another big factor that's been mentioned and touched upon several times. But where's the government role here in Clark? How can the government support Clark? This is a great example. This land use plan didn't exist before, and before you didn't have Singapore Airlines Engineering MRO facility. You didn't have Metrojet MRO facility. Why did they come in? Because the government gave them a land use plan and said, here is where we want you to set up shop, here's where we've master planned it, here's where you can guarantee your operations to be for the next 15, 20 years, 50 years. This is where we want you, and here's the information we're providing you to bring you in. And that leads to investment. That's what's necessary for future investment into Clark and future growth. The government needs to enumerate that plan clearly and state exactly what they have in mind for the development of this. The land use plan could not be more important. And thankfully they have that now, and they've been implementing that, and that's helping tremendously. So the wish list from the private sector perspective regarding Clark's role in the Philippines and Clark's support from the government, recognition of a twin airport concept, and CIA's designation as an alternative international gateway. Immediate development of the terminal and support facilities to keep up with the airport's growth and demand. Commitment for future development of 3rd parallel runway. The government should be transparent regulator, risk sharer, and source of incentives to attract private sector partners to support the development of Clark. And Clark should be viewed as both enhancing the connectivity of the citizens within the Philippines and boosting the global competitiveness as an FDI and trade destination for Asia. This is something that I really believe in, and I say this often. It's not a zero-sum game. And what I mean by that, this comparison of zero-sum versus non-zero-sum, if Clark continues to grow and succeeds, it's not at the expense of NAIA or another airport in Cebu or Davao or any other area in the Philippines. As I think Greg has very clearly demonstrated, it only helps the entire country, the entire region, the connectivity of all areas. It even helps that twin airport concept. In every one of the examples he showed for his twin airport concept, it's not that one airport grew and the other, basically became smaller and dwarfed and retarded growth. It's that both grew in parallel together and both benefited, and both regions benefited. And one thing that's very important to mention is the congestion in NAIA, the infrastructure constraints, not in NAIA, but of Manila in general. All these issues that are not necessarily directly related to the airport, but in overall infrastructure of aviation, seaport, roads, sewage, drainage, flooding, You need an alternative growth pole outside of Manila that's independent of Manila that can now be an alternative for investment, for connectivity, for these basically these industries to go and set up shop. Otherwise, they have no choice. They're going to continue to go to Manila. Or at some point, they're going to say, you know what, Manila is not attractive because of flooding, because of the infrastructure, and because of the traffic, and we'll go elsewhere in ASEAN. So at the end of the day, we're talking about, again, lost opportunities. And that's why I'm talking about this zero sum. The further development and utilization of Clark, it's a win-win for the country. It's a win-win for everyone. So I've said this several times, and I think this is very, very key. The uncertainty leads to less investment and missed opportunities for the Philippines as a whole. Not just for Clark, not just for Manila, but everywhere. The connectivity that's been provided by these low-cost carriers is a boon to Boracay, to Davao, to all these new tourist destination markets that are now opening up because you have air liberalization and operators who are willing to fly there. So when AirAsia can't bring in more of their planes because there's not a terminal to support the passengers they want to put through the terminal facilities here at Clark, they divert that plane. They put it in another operation. That's a lost opportunity. That's lost potential revenue. That's lost tourism. That's lost everywhere. So you want to bridge that gap. And how do you bridge that gap? I think you bridge it by a clear enumerated plan. You bridge it by the synergy between the government and the private sector working together in parallel through the land use plan that's been done, through these studies that have come and really provided certainty for the business sector and what to do in terms of their investment. So with that, I appreciate your attention, and I thank you for your time.